Picture this. You wake up one morning, step outside your front door, and within seconds, deadly radiation begins tearing through your DNA. The dust beneath your feet is so toxic, it could kill you with a single breath. The temperature around you swings from hot enough to melt, led to cold enough to freeze your blood solid. And if you somehow survive all of that, you're still trapped in a place where a single equipment failure means certain death, with no hope of rescue from anyone anywhere. Welcome to life on the moon. And before you dismiss this as science fiction, understand that everything I just described is the brutal reality that awaits anyone foolish enough to try calling our nearest celestial neighbor home. Tonight, we're diving deep into why the moon represents perhaps the most hostile environment humans have ever contemplated inhabiting. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll understand why even our most optimistic space agencies approach lunar colonization with a mixture of excitement and absolute terror. But here's what makes this truly fascinating. Despite these seemingly insurmountable challenges, humanity is still planning to return to the moon. Not just for quick visits like the Apollo missions, but to stay, to build bases, to live there permanently, which raises an incredible question that we're going to explore together. Are we completely insane, or do we actually have the technology and determination to overcome an environment that seems designed to kill us in every conceivable way? I've spent months researching this topic, diving into NASA reports, scientific studies, and first-hand accounts from the Apollo astronauts who actually experienced these dangers. What I discovered will shock you. The moon isn't just inhospitable. It's actively trying to murder you from the moment you arrive. And yet, the solutions that engineers and scientists are developing to combat these threats are so ingenious, so creative, that they border on miraculous. So grab something warm to drink, settle in, and prepare to have your mind blown. Because we're about to explore why living on the moon would be like playing a deadly game where the house always wins, and the stakes are literally life and death. Let's start with something that sounds almost poetic, but is actually terrifying, beyond imagination. Radiation. On Earth, we live under an invisible shield that protects us every single day of our lives. Our planet's magnetosphere and atmosphere work together like a cosmic bodyguard, deflecting and absorbing the deadly particles that constantly stream toward us from deep space. We take this protection so completely for granted that most people don't even know it exists. The moon has no such protection, none whatsoever. It's like stepping outside during a nuclear apocalypse, except the radiation never stops, never decreases, and comes from every direction at once. Recent measurements from China's Chang'e 4 lander revealed that astronauts on the lunar surface would absorb radiation at a rate of 1,369 microsieverts per day. To put that in perspective, that's 2.6 times higher than what astronauts experience on the International Space Station, and they're already considered to be living in a high radiation environment. But here's where it gets truly frightening. Those numbers represent the baseline, the calm before the storm. Because the sun doesn't just emit a steady stream of radiation. It has tantrums. Solar flares and coronal mass ejections can suddenly increase radiation levels by orders of magnitude, turning an already dangerous environment into an immediate death sentence for anyone caught on the surface. The Apollo program experienced this firsthand, and it nearly resulted in one of the most tragic disasters in space exploration history. In August 1972, between the Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 missions, a series of intense solar flares erupted from the sun for more than a week. These weren't minor events. They were X-class flares, the most powerful category we have. The radiation levels were so extreme that if any astronauts had been on the lunar surface during this period, they would have received a lethal dose within hours. Think about that for a moment. The Apollo 16 crew had returned to Earth in April, and Apollo 17 wasn't scheduled until December. Pure luck saved their lives. If the timing had been different, if NASA had scheduled a mission during that week in August, we would have watched helplessly as astronauts died from radiation poisoning 240,000 miles away, with absolutely no way to help them. This isn't speculation or worst-case scenario thinking. This is documented scientific fact. The radiation environment on the moon is so severe that without proper shielding, astronauts would be more likely to develop cataracts, heart disease, and cancer. The charged particles, primarily protons and heavy nuclei stripped of their electrons, penetrate human tissue and damage DNA at the cellular level. It's like being slowly cooked from the inside out, except the cooking never stops. But radiation is just the beginning of our problems. Let's talk about something that sounds almost mundane until you understand its true nature. Dust, not the kind of dust you find under your bed or on your bookshelf. Lunar dust is a substance so uniquely hostile that it turned even the short Apollo missions into exercises in equipment survival. During the Apollo missions, astronauts quickly discovered that lunar dust wasn't just annoying, it was downright dangerous. The dust particles are incredibly fine, smaller than 20 micrometers, with jagged, razor-sharp edges that never get worn down because there's no wind or water on the moon to smooth them out. These microscopic glass shards carry an electrostatic charge that makes them stick to absolutely everything they touch. Spacesuits, equipment, instruments, you name it. Pete Conrad, commander of Apollo 12, reported that their spacesuits were more worn after just 8 hours of surface activity than their training suits were after 100 hours of use on Earth. The dust had actually worn through the outer layer of their suits and into the multi-layer insulation. He estimated that 1 or 2 additional spacewalks could have resulted in a complete pressure failure. Imagine that. Death by dust abrasion. The Apollo 16 mission experienced gauge dials so scratched up by lunar dust that they became completely unreadable. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist on Apollo 17, found that his helmet's sun visor was so scratched by dust particles that he couldn't see in certain directions. These weren't minor inconveniences. These were potentially life-threatening equipment failures caused by what most people would consider dirt. But the real nightmare begins when you inhale it. Apollo astronauts reported that lunar dust made their eyes water and their throats sore after just brief exposures inside their spacecraft. The dust is so fine that it penetrates seals and filters, finding its way into supposedly protected environments. And remember, these were short missions. The longest stay on the moon was just 3 days. Imagine what months or years of exposure would do. Medical experts now believe that prolonged exposure to lunar dust could cause serious respiratory problems, potentially including lung cancer. The particles are so small and so sharp that they can penetrate deep into lung tissue, causing damage similar to what we see in asbestos exposure. Current safety guidelines suggest limiting exposure to just 0.3 milligrams per cubic meter for missions lasting 1 to 6 months. That's an incredibly small amount, roughly equivalent to a few grains of sand in a space the size of a refrigerator. Now let's add another layer to this nightmare scenario: water, or rather the complete absence of it. The moon is one of the driest places in our solar system. There's no liquid water anywhere on its surface. None. Zero. For a species that's roughly 60% water and requires constant hydration to survive, this presents what you might call a significant logistical challenge. Scientists have confirmed that water ice exists in permanently shadowed craters near the moon's poles, locked in regions that haven't seen sunlight for billions of years. These areas maintain temperatures around -230 degrees Celsius, cold enough to keep water frozen solid, essentially forever. But here's the catch. Getting to this ice and extracting it would require technology that we're still developing, and the energy requirements are staggering. Current extraction methods being tested require heating the lunar soil to drive off the water vapor, then capturing and condensing it. The energy cost ranges from 4 to 7 watt-hours per gram of water extracted, with collection efficiency hovering around 29 to 63%. To put that in perspective, extracting enough water for a single person's daily needs would require the energy output of several large solar panels working continuously. And that's assuming perfect conditions and no equipment failures. The extraction process creates its own problems, including the formation of a thermal insulation layer of non-volatile soil that actually makes the process less efficient over time. It's like trying to mine ice cream in an oven while the oven gets hotter the longer you work. The alternative, shipping water from Earth, is economically insane. Water weighs about 8 pounds per gallon, and current launch costs make every pound sent to the moon incredibly expensive. A single person needs roughly 2 gallons of water per day for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene. Do the math, and you'll quickly realize why water extraction on the moon isn't just preferable. It's absolutely essential for any long-term presence. But even if we solve the water problem, we're still faced with an environment that swings between temperature extremes that would challenge even our most advanced technology. The moon's day lasts 29.5 Earth days, meaning you get about 2 weeks of blazing sunlight, followed by 2 weeks of absolute darkness. During the day, surface temperatures can reach 123 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead. During the night, they plummet to -153 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze carbon dioxide solid. These aren't gentle temperature swings that you can adapt to over time. These are sudden, dramatic shifts that would destroy most materials, not specifically designed to handle them. Metals expand and contract, seals fail, electronics malfunction, and anything containing liquid freezes solid or boils away. Building materials that work perfectly on Earth become brittle and fragile in these conditions. The psychological challenges would be equally severe. Imagine living in a place where you experience 2 weeks of constant daylight, followed by 2 weeks of complete darkness, month after month, year after year. Earth's natural circadian rhythms are based on a 24-hour cycle of light and darkness. The moon's 29.5-day cycle would wreak havoc on human sleep patterns, mental health, and overall psychological well-being. Studies of people living in extreme isolation, like researchers in Antarctica or submarine crews, show that prolonged confinement and separation from normal environments can lead to depression, anxiety, cognitive impairment, and interpersonal conflicts. On the moon, these effects would be amplified by the knowledge that you're completely cut off from Earth, with no possibility of rescue if something goes wrong. Communication delays would compound the isolation. Even at its closest approach, the moon is far enough away that radio signals take 1.3 seconds to travel each way. That might not sound like much, but it makes real-time conversation impossible. Every exchange becomes a stilted back and forth where you speak, wait, listen to the response, wait, then speak again. The psychological impact of this communication barrier, combined with the knowledge that you're truly alone in one of the most hostile environments imaginable, would test the limits of human endurance. The limits of human endurance. And then there's the construction nightmare that would make even the most experienced engineers wake up in cold sweats. Building anything permanent on the moon isn't just challenging. It's like trying to construct a skyscraper while wearing oven mitts in a sandstorm during an earthquake. The combination of hard vacuum, extreme temperatures, and that relentless dust creates a perfect storm of engineering impossibilities. Let's start with the basics. Every single construction material you might want to use behaves completely differently in the lunar environment. Concrete requires water to cure properly, but liquid water boils instantly in vacuum. Steel becomes brittle in extreme cold and expands dramatically in heat. Plastics outgas in vacuum, releasing chemicals that could contaminate your living space or damage sensitive equipment. Even simple adhesives stop working when the temperature swings hundreds of degrees in either direction. The most promising solution scientists have developed is something called lunar concrete, made from the moon's own regolith mixed with various binding agents. But here's where it gets interesting and terrifying at the same time. The process of creating this material requires heating lunar soil to temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius, essentially melting it into a glass-like substance that can be shaped and cooled into building blocks. The energy requirements for this process are astronomical. We're talking about industrial-scale manufacturing operations that would need to run continuously for years just to produce enough material for a basic shelter. And remember, all of this equipment would need to function flawlessly in an environment that destroys most machinery within weeks or months. The Chinese U-2 rover, one of the most advanced pieces of technology ever sent to the moon, became immobilized after just 2 days when lunar dust infiltrated its control circuits. But let's say we somehow overcome the construction challenges. Let's imagine we've built our lunar base using advanced materials and engineering techniques that don't exist yet. We still face the fundamental problem of keeping humans alive inside these structures. Life support systems on the moon would need to be more reliable and sophisticated than anything we've ever built, because failure isn't just inconvenient, it's immediately fatal. Think about your house for a moment. How often does something break? A light bulb burns out, a pipe leaks, the heating system needs repair. On Earth, these are minor inconveniences. On the moon, any system failure could kill everyone inside within minutes. Your air recycling system stops working. You suffocate. Your heating system fails during the 2-week lunar night. You freeze to death. Your radiation shielding develops a crack. You're slowly cooked by cosmic rays. The redundancy required would be mind-boggling. Every critical system would need multiple backups, and those backups would need backups. NASA engineers estimate that a lunar base would require at least triple redundancy for all life-critical systems, meaning every essential function would need 3 independent ways of operating. The complexity and weight of such systems would be staggering. And here's something that might surprise you. The moon's low gravity, which sounds like it would be fun and make everything easier, actually creates its own set of serious health problems. The human body evolved under Earth's gravity over millions of years. Our bones, muscles, cardiovascular system, and even our inner ear balance mechanisms are all calibrated for 1 g of gravitational force. In the moon's 1/6 gravity environment, astronauts would face rapid bone density loss, muscle atrophy, and cardiovascular deconditioning. Studies of astronauts on the International Space Station show that even with 2.5 hours of exercise per day, they still lose significant bone mass and muscle strength. On the moon, where gravity is even weaker, these effects would be accelerated and potentially irreversible. The implications are sobering. Astronauts who spend years on the moon might find themselves physically unable to return to Earth. Their bones could become so weak that Earth's gravity would literally crush them. We're talking about a one-way physiological journey where your body adapts to an alien environment to the point where your home planet becomes uninhabitable. Then there's the food situation, which transforms from a simple matter of nutrition into a complex engineering challenge. Growing food on the moon would require creating artificial environments that replicate Earth's conditions inside sealed, climate-controlled facilities. But plants need more than just soil and water. They need atmospheric pressure, the right gas mixture, proper lighting, and protection from radiation. Experiments aboard the International Space Station have shown that plants can grow in space, but they require constant monitoring and adjustment. Root systems behave differently in low gravity, water distribution becomes problematic, and even pollination becomes a challenge when there's no wind or insects. On the moon, you'd essentially need to build high-tech greenhouses that could maintain Earth-like conditions while withstanding temperature swings, radiation exposure, and the constant threat of dust infiltration. The energy requirements for food production would be enormous. Plants need specific wavelengths of light for photosynthesis, and providing this artificially requires significant electrical power. During the moon's 2-week night periods, all lighting would need to come from stored energy or alternative power sources. When you calculate the energy needed for lighting, heating, air circulation, water pumping, and all the other systems required for agriculture, you quickly realize that food production alone could consume most of your available power. Speaking of power, let's dive into what might be the most fundamental challenge of all: energy. Everything we've discussed so far, from life support to construction to food production, requires massive amounts of reliable electricity. On Earth, when your power goes out, it's annoying. On the moon, it's a death sentence. Solar power seems like an obvious solution. The moon receives plenty of sunlight during its 2-week day periods, and without an atmosphere to absorb or scatter the light, solar panels would actually be more efficient than on Earth. But here's the brutal reality. For 2 weeks out of every month, you'd have no solar power at all. 0. During the lunar night, temperatures plummet so low that most battery technologies stop functioning entirely. Nuclear power presents its own challenges. While nuclear reactors could provide continuous electricity regardless of the day-night cycle, they're incredibly complex systems that require regular maintenance, cooling, and fuel replacement. The reactor components would need to withstand the same extreme conditions that destroy everything else on the moon. And any malfunction could be catastrophic not just for the power supply, but for the entire base. NASA is developing new technologies like kilopower reactors specifically for lunar applications, but these are still experimental. The largest version being tested produces about 10 kilowatts of power, roughly enough for a few houses on Earth. A lunar base with life support, construction equipment, food production, and scientific instruments would likely require 10 times that amount or more. The waste heat management from any power system creates additional complications. On Earth, excess heat dissipates into the atmosphere through convection and conduction. In the vacuum of space, heat can only be radiated away, which is much less efficient. Power systems on the moon would need massive radiator arrays to prevent overheating, adding complexity and weight to an already challenging engineering problem. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of lunar living would be the complete isolation from the natural world. Humans evolved as part of Earth's ecosystem. We're accustomed to weather patterns, seasonal changes, the sounds of wind and water, the sight of clouds and birds, the smell of rain and flowers. The moon offers none of this. It's a sterile, unchanging landscape of grey dust and black sky. Psychological studies of people in extreme isolation environments reveal disturbing patterns. Researchers stationed in Antarctica, despite being on Earth with the possibility of evacuation, often experience depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, and cognitive impairment. They report feeling disconnected from reality, struggling with interpersonal relationships, and developing obsessive thoughts about home. On the moon, these effects would be amplified beyond anything we've ever studied. You'd be looking up at Earth every day, seeing the blue and green world where all of human history unfolded. knowing that you can never casually return there. The psychological weight of that isolation, combined with the constant stress of living in a deadly environment where any mistake could kill you, would test the absolute limits of human mental endurance. The communication delay, which seems minor at first glance, would compound this psychological burden in unexpected ways. Imagine trying to maintain relationships with family and friends when every conversation is interrupted by that 1.3-second delay. Phone calls become stilted exchanges where you constantly talk over each other or wait awkwardly for responses. Video calls feel disconnected and artificial. Over time, these communication barriers could lead to profound feelings of alienation and disconnection from human society. Emergency medical care presents another layer of impossibility. On Earth, if you have a heart attack, break a bone, or develop appendicitis, help is usually minutes away. Ambulances, hospitals, and emergency rooms are part of the infrastructure we take for granted. On the Moon, you'd be completely on your own for any medical emergency. The nearest hospital would be 240,000 miles away, and even the fastest spacecraft would take days to reach you. This means that every person on a lunar base would need extensive medical training. Not just basic first aid, but surgical skills, diagnostic abilities, and knowledge of how to treat everything from broken bones to serious infections. The medical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies required would be staggering, and all of it would need to function perfectly in an environment that degrades most materials rapidly. Consider something as simple as a dental emergency. A severe toothache or broken tooth that would be easily treatable on Earth could become a debilitating problem that affects your ability to work and survive. Dental surgery in a lunar environment, with limited equipment and no possibility of evacuation, would be a nightmare scenario that could easily become life-threatening. The equipment maintenance nightmare extends far beyond what most people imagine. Every single piece of technology on a lunar base would need constant attention and repair. That omnipresent dust doesn't just coat surfaces, it infiltrates every mechanism, clogs every filter, and abrades every moving part. Motors seize up, seals fail, electronics overheat, and optical instruments become useless as their lenses get scratched beyond recognition. During the Apollo missions, camera equipment was nearly destroyed by dust infiltration after just a few days of use. Imagine trying to maintain computers, life support systems, manufacturing equipment, and scientific instruments for months or years in that same environment. You'd need massive stockpiles of replacement parts, specialized cleaning equipment, and repair tools that don't exist yet. The psychological impact of constantly fighting equipment failures can't be underestimated. When your survival depends on machinery working perfectly, every strange noise, every error message, every minor malfunction becomes a source of intense stress and anxiety. The constant vigilance required to monitor and maintain all these systems would be mentally exhausting beyond anything we've experienced. Anything we've experienced. And we haven't even touched on one of the most insidious threats that would slowly drive lunar inhabitants to madness. Atmospheric contamination. Every time humans engage in activity on the Moon, they're essentially poisoning their own environment. When spacecraft land, they blast enormous quantities of gas and particles into the lunar atmosphere. A single Starship landing, for instance, would inject roughly 10 times the mass of the Moon's entire existing atmosphere into the surrounding environment. But it doesn't stop there. Human habitation creates continuous contamination. Astronauts need cooling systems, typically water-based, that constantly release vapor. Habitats filled with oxygen and nitrogen leak gases every time airlocks are opened. Equipment outgasses chemicals and compounds that accumulate in the thin lunar atmosphere. What starts as a pristine environment quickly becomes a soup of human-generated pollutants that could pose serious health risks and interfere with sensitive scientific equipment, the contamination isn't just atmospheric. Every footstep, every rover track, every construction activity disturbs regolith that's remained undisturbed for billions of years. This creates persistent dust clouds that can travel for miles in the low-gravity environment, affecting areas far beyond the immediate worksite. Imagine trying to conduct astronomical observations or delicate scientific experiments while your neighbors are constantly kicking up dust storms that take hours to settle. Let's talk about something that sounds almost mundane, but becomes absolutely critical in a lunar environment. Waste management. On Earth, we flush toilets, throw away garbage, and generally don't think twice about waste disposal. The Moon offers no such luxury. Every single waste product, from human waste to broken equipment, must be either recycled, reused, or stored indefinitely. There's no away to throw things to. Human waste management becomes a complex engineering challenge. Traditional sewage treatment relies on gravity, water flow, and bacterial decomposition, none of which work properly in the lunar environment. Waste processing systems would need to recover water, extract useful nutrients, and safely dispose of or store the remaining material. The psychological impact of living in such a closed system, where you're constantly reminded that everything must be recycled and nothing can be wasted, would add another layer of stress to an already challenging existence. The recycling requirements extend far beyond human waste. Every scrap of metal, every piece of plastic, every electronic component that breaks would need to be processed and reused. The alternative is to continually ship replacement materials from Earth, which would be economically unsustainable for any permanent settlement. This means that lunar inhabitants would need to become experts in materials science, manufacturing, and recycling technologies that don't yet exist. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of lunar habitation is the cascade failure scenario. On Earth, when something goes wrong, it usually affects one system at a time. A power outage doesn't immediately threaten your air supply. A broken water pipe doesn't compromise your radiation shielding. On the Moon, everything is interconnected in ways that create terrifying vulnerabilities. Imagine this scenario. A micrometeorite, smaller than a grain of sand but traveling at thousands of miles per hour, punctures your habitat's outer shell. The immediate pressure loss triggers emergency seals, but the rapid decompression damages your air recycling system. As carbon dioxide levels rise, the backup life support kicks in, but it draws additional power from your already strained electrical grid. The increased load causes a power fluctuation that damages your water recycling equipment. Now you're facing simultaneous failures of multiple life-critical systems, all triggered by a piece of space debris too small to see. These cascade failures are what keep lunar mission planners awake at night. Unlike isolated system failures, cascades can overwhelm your ability to respond, even with extensive backup systems. The interconnected nature of lunar habitats means that any significant problem can quickly spiral into a life-threatening emergency that requires immediate evacuation or results in total loss of the facility. The transportation logistics for establishing and maintaining a lunar base boggle the mind. Current launch costs to low Earth orbit run tens of thousands of dollars per kilogram. Getting to the Moon costs significantly more. When you calculate the mass of equipment, supplies, construction materials, and backup systems needed for a permanent lunar base, you're looking at thousands of tons of cargo. At current prices, the transportation costs alone would dwarf the budgets of most countries. This economic reality forces lunar planners to pursue in situ resource utilization with an urgency that borders on desperation. The ability to extract water, manufacture construction materials, and produce consumables from lunar resources isn't just preferable, it's absolutely essential for any sustainable presence. But as we've seen, these extraction and manufacturing processes require enormous energy inputs and sophisticated equipment that must function flawlessly in the hostile lunar environment. The technology development timeline presents another sobering reality. Most of the systems needed for permanent lunar habitation don't exist yet. They're not just improvements on existing technology, they're entirely new categories of equipment that must be invented, tested, and perfected. Radiation shielding systems that can be constructed from lunar materials. Life support systems that can operate for years without resupply from Earth. Manufacturing equipment that can produce everything from electronics to pharmaceuticals using only lunar resources. Each of these technological challenges represents years or decades of research and development. The radiation shielding alone requires burying habitats under 80 centimeters of lunar regolith while maintaining structural integrity and preventing dust infiltration. The engineering required to excavate, transport, and precisely place that much material using remotely operated equipment is staggering. Food production technology faces similar developmental hurdles. Growing plants in artificial environments with perfect atmospheric control, radiation protection, and nutrient delivery systems requires integrating dozens of technologies that have never been combined before. The failure rate for closed-loop agricultural systems, even on Earth, remains discouragingly high. Scaling these systems to support human populations while operating in lunar conditions pushes the boundaries of what's technically feasible. The human factors research is equally sobering. We simply don't understand the long-term effects of living in partial gravity environments. Astronauts on the International Space Station experience bone density loss, muscle atrophy, and cardiovascular changes despite rigorous exercise protocols. The Moon's 1/6 gravity would likely cause similar problems, but potentially at different rates and with different complications. We're essentially planning to conduct a massive human experiment with irreversible consequences. Reproductive biology in lunar conditions remains completely unstudied. Would human reproduction even be possible in the Moon's low gravity and high radiation environment? Animal studies suggest that development could be severely compromised, but we have no data on human reproduction in partial gravity conditions. Any permanent lunar settlement would need to address these fundamental biological questions, possibly discovering that long-term human habitation simply isn't biologically viable. The psychological research is equally incomplete. The longest isolation studies conducted on Earth pale in comparison to the isolation that lunar inhabitants would experience. Antarctica research stations can be evacuated in emergencies. Submarine crews know their missions will end. Lunar colonists would face the prospect of permanent separation from Earth, with no possibility of rescue or evacuation if things go wrong psychologically. Communication technology adds another layer of complexity that's often overlooked. The 1.3-second delay might seem minor, but it fundamentally changes how humans interact. Real-time collaboration becomes impossible. Emergency communications lose their immediacy. Video conferences become stilted exchanges that lack the natural flow of human conversation. Over months and years, these communication barriers could contribute to psychological isolation and depression in ways we're only beginning to understand. The medical training requirements for lunar inhabitants would be extraordinary. Every person would need skills equivalent to an emergency room physician, surgeon, dentist, pharmacist, and medical technician combined. The breadth of knowledge required to handle any possible medical emergency without outside assistance goes far beyond what any individual could realistically master. Yet the alternative, accepting that certain medical emergencies would be fatal, is equally unacceptable for a permanent settlement. Pharmaceutical storage and production present their own challenges. Most medications have limited shelf lives and require specific storage conditions. Creating a pharmaceutical manufacturing capability on the Moon would require chemical processing equipment, quality control systems, and raw materials that would need to be either shipped from Earth or synthesized from lunar resources. The complexity and reliability requirements for such systems exceed anything currently in operation. Equipment redundancy requirements reach absurd levels when you consider the consequences of failure. Critical systems would need not just backup equipment, but backup equipment for the backup equipment. The mass penalty for this level of redundancy would be enormous, requiring additional transportation costs and construction complexity. Yet without such redundancy, any equipment failure could trigger a cascade that kills everyone on the base. The spare parts inventory needed to maintain a lunar base over multiple years would rival the complexity of a major industrial facility. Every bolt, circuit board, seal, and component would need to be either stockpiled in advance or manufacturable on-site using lunar resources. The logistics of tracking, storing, and maintaining such an inventory in the harsh lunar environment would require sophisticated systems and constant attention. Quality control for locally manufactured items becomes a matter of life and death. On Earth, if a component fails, you replace it and move on. On the Moon, component failure could be catastrophic. Every item produced locally would need rigorous testing and quality assurance, requiring additional equipment, time, and expertise. The manufacturing tolerances and reliability standards would exceed anything used in terrestrial applications. The psychological burden of knowing that any mistake could be fatal would weigh heavily on lunar inhabitants. Every decision, from routine maintenance to emergency responses, carries life or death consequences. The stress of living under such conditions, combined with isolation, confinement, and the hostile environment, could lead to decision-making errors that compound over time. Human error, normally a minor concern, becomes an existential threat when there's no margin for mistakes and no possibility of rescue. Environmental monitoring systems would need to track thousands of parameters continuously: air quality, radiation levels, structural integrity, equipment performance, power consumption, water purity, temperature control, and dozens of other critical measurements would require constant surveillance. The data processing and analysis capabilities needed to identify potential problems before they become critical would require sophisticated artificial intelligence systems that don't currently exist. The maintenance schedule for a lunar base would be relentless. Unlike Earth facilities where some maintenance can be deferred, lunar equipment would require constant attention to prevent failures that could quickly become catastrophic. The workload for maintaining all the systems necessary for survival would consume a significant portion of each day, leaving little time for scientific research, construction projects, or other productive activities. Training requirements for lunar colonists would be extraordinary in both scope and depth. Each person would need expertise in multiple engineering disciplines, medical skills, psychological counseling abilities, and scientific knowledge. The training timeline for developing such comprehensive skills would likely require years of intensive preparation, and even then, the complexity of lunar operations would exceed any individual's ability to master completely. The social dynamics of small, isolated groups under extreme stress have been studied in various contexts, and the results are often disturbing. Personality conflicts, leadership disputes, and interpersonal tensions that would be manageable in normal circumstances can become explosive when people are confined together with no escape. The psychological screening and team selection for lunar missions would need to identify individuals capable of maintaining stable relationships under extraordinary stress for extended periods. Extended periods. The backup life support systems present their own technological nightmares that most people never consider. When your primary air recycling system fails on Earth, you simply open a window. On the Moon, your backup systems become the thin line between breathing and suffocating in minutes. But here's what makes it truly terrifying. These backup systems can't just work occasionally. They need to function flawlessly for years without maintenance, replacement parts, or technical support from Earth. Current life support technology struggles to operate reliably for months, let alone the years required for permanent lunar habitation. The International Space Station, humanity's most advanced life support laboratory, requires constant resupply missions and regular component replacements. Systems that work perfectly in Earth orbit face entirely different challenges in the lunar environment, where temperature extremes, radiation, and dust infiltration push every component beyond its design limits. Carbon dioxide scrubbing systems, essential for preventing poisoning from your own exhaled breath, rely on chemical filters that have finite lifespans. On the Moon, you'd need massive stockpiles of replacement cartridges, or the ability to manufacture new ones from lunar materials. The chemical processes involved require precise temperature and humidity control, which becomes incredibly challenging when outside temperatures swing between boiling and freezing every 2 weeks. Oxygen generation systems face similar complications. Electrolysis equipment that splits water into hydrogen and oxygen requires pure water, stable electrical power, and components that can withstand thousands of heating and cooling cycles. The hydrogen byproduct must be safely vented or captured, creating additional system complexity. When these systems fail, and they will fail, you have hours at most to implement repairs before carbon dioxide poisoning becomes lethal. The water recycling nightmare extends far beyond simple filtration. Lunar inhabitants would need to reclaim water from every possible source, including humidity condensation, urine processing, and wastewater treatment. The recycling efficiency would need to approach 95% or higher to minimize resupply requirements from Earth. Achieving such efficiency requires multiple processing stages, each with its own failure points and maintenance requirements. Urine processing alone requires sophisticated chemical and biological treatment systems. The high salt and mineral content must be removed without wasting the precious water content. Pharmaceutical residues, hormones, and other biological compounds need filtration that goes far beyond anything used on Earth. The psychological impact of knowing that every drop of water you drink has been recycled from waste products adds another layer of stress to an already challenging existence. Atmospheric composition monitoring becomes critical when you're living in a sealed environment with no natural air circulation. Trace gases that would be harmless in Earth's vast atmosphere can accumulate to dangerous levels in confined spaces. Carbon monoxide from equipment operation, formaldehyde from material outgassing, and dozens of other compounds require continuous monitoring and active removal. The sensor systems needed for such comprehensive atmospheric analysis must operate continuously without calibration or replacement for years. Fire suppression in a lunar habitat presents unique challenges that highlight how everything familiar becomes dangerous in space. Traditional fire suppression systems rely on gravity to distribute suppressants and atmosphere to carry away heat and smoke. In the Moon's low gravity and artificial atmosphere, fires behave unpredictably, spreading in strange patterns and producing smoke that doesn't rise naturally. Halon and other chemical suppressants commonly used in spacecraft can become toxic in the confined atmosphere of a lunar habitat. Water-based systems risk creating electrical hazards and equipment damage that could trigger cascade failures. The ideal fire suppression system would need to extinguish fires quickly without producing toxic byproducts or damaging critical equipment. Such systems exist only in theoretical designs that have never been tested in actual lunar conditions. Emergency evacuation protocols become exercises in impossibility when your safe haven is surrounded by vacuum. On Earth, building codes require multiple exit routes and safe assembly areas outside the structure. On the Moon, outside means instant death. Emergency procedures would need to route people to pressurized safe rooms with independent life support. But what happens when the emergency affects those areas too? Spacesuit maintenance emerges as a daily life or death activity rather than occasional equipment checks. Every lunar inhabitant would need multiple suits for redundancy, but maintaining them requires specialized knowledge, tools, and replacement components. Suit seals degrade under temperature cycling. Fabric develops microtears from dust abrasion, and electronic systems fail from radiation exposure. The complexity of spacesuit systems rivals that of small spacecraft, yet they must be maintained by users with limited technical support. The psychological impact of suiting up for routine tasks outside would be profound. Every time you need to venture onto the lunar surface, you're essentially preparing for a spacewalk with all the associated risks and procedures. What takes minutes on Earth, like checking equipment or collecting samples, becomes hour-long expeditions requiring careful planning, buddy systems, and emergency contingencies. The mental exhaustion from such constant vigilance would accumulate over time. Construction material degradation accelerates dramatically in the lunar environment, making long-term structural integrity a constant concern. Materials that last decades on Earth may fail within months when exposed to temperature cycling, radiation, and micrometeorite impacts. Metal components expand and contract with each temperature cycle, creating stress fractures that propagate over time. Polymer seals become brittle and crack, allowing pressure leaks that could be catastrophic. Structural monitoring systems would need to continuously assess the integrity of habitat walls, windows, airlocks, and support systems. Crack detection in a pressurized environment becomes critical when a small failure could lead to explosive decompression. The monitoring equipment itself must operate reliably in the same harsh conditions that threaten the structures it's designed to protect. Foundation stability presents unique challenges on the Moon's regolith surface. The fine, loosely packed lunar soil has unpredictable load-bearing characteristics, especially when subjected to the vibrations from construction equipment, life support systems, and human activity. Structures could slowly settle or shift over time, creating stress concentrations that lead to catastrophic failures. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic monitoring would be essential for detecting subsurface changes before they affect structural stability. Thermal expansion and contraction create engineering nightmares that compound over time. Every component, from tiny electronic circuits to massive structural beams, expands and contracts with each lunar day-night cycle. Different materials expand at different rates, creating interface stresses that can tear apart carefully designed systems. Thermal expansion joints, common in Earth construction, become critical components that must operate flawlessly through hundreds of heating and cooling cycles. Airlock systems represent some of the most complex and failure-prone components of any lunar habitat. These chambers must transition between the habitat's pressurized environment and the Moon's vacuum while preventing contamination, maintaining structural integrity, and operating reliably thousands of times. The sealing mechanisms must work perfectly despite dust infiltration, temperature extremes, and mechanical wear from constant use. Airlock contamination control becomes essential for preventing lunar dust from infiltrating living spaces. Current designs include multiple chambers, high-pressure air jets for dust removal, and specialized cleaning procedures that must be followed religiously. The time required for proper decontamination procedures would make simple tasks incredibly time-consuming and limit the frequency of surface operations. Emergency airlock procedures must account for scenarios where the primary systems fail during critical operations. Backup power systems, manual overrides, and emergency atmosphere supplies would need to operate independently of the main habitat systems. The complexity of such backup systems increases the likelihood of failures, while adding weight and maintenance requirements that strain the overall facility design. Power distribution systems face unique challenges in the lunar environment that go far beyond simple electrical engineering. The combination of extreme temperatures, radiation exposure, and dust infiltration creates conditions that degrade electrical components rapidly. Transformers, switches, circuit breakers, and wiring insulation all face accelerated aging that reduces system reliability over time. Electrical fires in a lunar habitat could be catastrophic, not just because of the fire itself, but because of the toxic gases produced when electrical insulation burns in a confined atmosphere. Traditional electrical safety systems rely on ground fault protection that may not work properly in the Moon's unusual electrical environment. Static electricity buildup from dust particles could create unexpected electrical hazards that don't exist on Earth. Power storage systems must operate through temperature extremes that exceed the design limits of most battery technologies. Lithium-ion batteries, currently the most advanced storage technology, suffer permanent capacity loss when exposed to the temperature cycles experienced on the Moon. Alternative technologies like fuel cells or mechanical energy storage systems add complexity and maintenance requirements while providing uncertain reliability. Grid redundancy becomes essential when power failures mean immediate death rather than mere inconvenience. Multiple independent power generation systems, storage banks, and distribution networks would need to operate in parallel with automatic switching systems that respond faster than humans could react. The weight and complexity penalties for such redundancy would be enormous, yet anything less risks total system failure. Load management systems must balance power consumption across all facility systems while maintaining critical life support functions during power shortages. Automated systems would need to shed non-essential loads while maintaining minimum power for air circulation, heating, and emergency lighting. The software complexity required for such intelligent load management exceeds anything currently deployed in terrestrial power systems. Communication systems face degradation from radiation effects that accumulate over time, slowly corrupting electronic components and data storage systems. High-energy particles can flip bits in computer memory, corrupt stored data, and gradually damage semiconductor devices. Error correction systems and radiation-hardened components add weight, cost, and complexity while providing imperfect protection against the relentless radiation environment. Antenna systems on the lunar surface must maintain precise pointing toward Earth while withstanding temperature extremes, dust accumulation, and micrometeorite impacts. Mechanical pointing systems with moving parts face rapid wear and failure in the harsh lunar environment. Fixed antenna arrays require multiple units positioned around the facility to maintain communication coverage as the Moon rotates relative to Earth. Data storage and backup systems become critical when communication delays prevent real-time technical support from Earth. Local storage of technical manuals, repair procedures, medical databases, and operational information must remain accessible despite radiation-induced data corruption. Multiple backup systems with different storage technologies would be necessary to ensure information survival through equipment failures and radiation events. Emergency communication protocols must account for scenarios where primary systems fail during critical situations. Backup communication systems need independent power supplies, antenna systems, and signal processing equipment that can operate when main facility systems are offline. The complexity of maintaining multiple independent communication systems adds to the overall facility burden while providing uncertain reliability in emergency conditions. Scientific equipment operation becomes secondary to survival needs, yet many lunar missions would be justified primarily by their scientific value. Maintaining sensitive instruments in the harsh lunar environment requires constant attention and resources that compete with basic survival needs. Dust contamination, temperature cycling, and radiation exposure rapidly degrade instrument performance, requiring frequent calibration and component replacement. Laboratory facilities for sample analysis and scientific experiments must maintain contamination-free environments while operating in a habitat where dust infiltration is constant and atmospheric control is imperfect. Cleanroom standards that are routine on Earth become extraordinarily difficult to maintain when every surface operation introduces contamination that penetrates the most sophisticated filtration systems. Experiment scheduling and resource allocation become complex optimization problems when power, space, and human attention are severely limited. Scientific objectives that seem straightforward during mission planning become impossible when competing with the constant demands of equipment maintenance, system monitoring, and survival-related activities. The scientific productivity of lunar missions may fall far short of expectations due to operational realities. Data transmission and analysis face limitations from communication bandwidth and delay constraints that make real-time collaboration with Earth-based scientists impossible. Local data storage and analysis capabilities must be far more sophisticated than typical field research stations. Yet, they must operate reliably in an environment that rapidly degrades electronic systems. The scientific value of lunar research could be compromised by the practical limitations of conducting complex analysis with limited local resources. Sample contamination control becomes critical for scientific credibility, yet the dusty lunar environment makes contamination nearly inevitable. Every sample collection, transport, and storage procedure must prevent contamination while operating through spacesuits in low gravity with limited dexterity. Clean sample handling procedures that are routine in Earth laboratories become complex operations requiring specialized equipment and extensive training. Manufacturing capabilities for producing replacement parts and consumables locally would need to span multiple industrial processes, from metallurgy and electronics fabrication to pharmaceutical production and precision machining. Each manufacturing process requires specialized equipment, raw materials, quality control systems, and technical expertise that collectively exceed the capabilities of small teams operating in isolated conditions. Quality assurance for locally manufactured items becomes life-critical when component failures can be lethal. Testing procedures that are adequate for terrestrial applications may be insufficient when lives depend on perfect reliability. Destructive testing to verify component quality conflicts with the need to conserve materials and manufacturing capacity. Non-destructive testing equipment adds complexity and maintenance requirements while providing imperfect quality assurance. Raw material processing from lunar regolith requires industrial-scale equipment for mining, refining, and chemical processing. The energy requirements for extracting useful materials from lunar soil exceed the power generation capabilities of small facilities. Yet large-scale processing operations require massive equipment that would be prohibitively expensive to transport from Earth. The circular dependency between needing materials to build infrastructure and needing infrastructure to process materials creates a chicken and egg problem that may be insurmountable. Inventory management systems must track thousands of components, consumables, and materials while accounting for degradation rates, usage patterns, and emergency reserves. The logistics complexity exceeds that of major industrial facilities, yet it must be managed by small teams with limited time and attention for administrative tasks. Computer systems for inventory management must operate reliably despite radiation effects and must be maintained by users who have many other critical responsibilities. Human factors. Engineering for lunar habitats must account for psychological and physiological changes that occur during long-term isolation and partial gravity exposure. Equipment interfaces designed for Earth use may become unusable as human capabilities change over time. Cognitive performance, manual dexterity, and decision-making abilities could all be affected by the stress and isolation of lunar living, requiring adaptive systems that compensate for degraded human performance. Workspace design becomes critical when confined areas must serve multiple functions efficiently while maintaining psychological comfort. Lighting systems must provide circadian rhythm support despite the unnatural lunar day-night cycle. Noise control becomes essential when mechanical systems operate continuously in confined spaces. Privacy requirements compete with safety needs that mandate constant monitoring and communication among crew members. Ergonomic considerations for reduced gravity environments require completely new approaches to furniture design, work surfaces, and movement aids. Traditional chairs, tables, and storage systems don't work properly when objects and people behave differently than on Earth. Tool design must account for reduced weight and change momentum characteristics that affect how objects move and how forces are applied during work tasks. Exercise equipment design faces unique challenges in maintaining human fitness in partial gravity while operating reliably in the harsh lunar environment. Cardiovascular and resistance training equipment must simulate Earth-like loads while occupying minimal space and requiring minimal maintenance. The exercise requirements for maintaining bone density and muscle mass in partial gravity exceed anything experienced on Earth, yet the equipment must be lightweight and simple enough to transport and maintain on the Moon. Exercise safety becomes critical when injuries could be catastrophic in an environment with limited medical capabilities. Equipment failures that would be minor inconveniences on Earth could cause injuries that become life-threatening when sophisticated medical care is unavailable. Exercise protocols must balance fitness maintenance against injury risk in ways that have never been studied or tested in actual partial gravity conditions. Recreation and entertainment systems become essential for psychological health during long-term isolation, yet they represent additional weight, power consumption, and maintenance requirements that compete with survival systems. Virtual reality systems could provide psychological relief from the confined environment, but they require sophisticated computer systems that must operate reliably despite radiation effects and dust contamination. Social interaction systems must facilitate communication among crew members while providing privacy and personal space in extremely confined conditions. Conflict resolution procedures become critical when personality disputes could affect mission safety, and there's no possibility of separating conflicting individuals. Leadership structures and decision-making processes must account for the extreme stress and isolation that affect human judgment and emotional stability. Mental health monitoring and support systems become essential when psychological problems could affect mission safety and crew survival. Automated systems for detecting depression, anxiety, and cognitive impairment must operate continuously while respecting privacy and personal autonomy. Treatment options for psychological problems are limited when pharmaceutical supplies are constrained and professional mental health support is only available through delayed communication links with Earth. The cascade failure scenarios that keep engineers awake at night become more probable as systems become more complex and interdependent. Computer modeling of these failure modes reveals thousands of potential disaster scenarios, each requiring backup systems, emergency procedures, and recovery protocols that add to the overall facility complexity. The mathematical probability of experiencing at least one major system failure increases dramatically with mission duration, approaching certainty for permanent settlements. Risk assessment methodologies developed for terrestrial applications become inadequate when dealing with the extreme conditions and isolation of lunar operations. Traditional safety factors and redundancy calculations don't account for the inability to evacuate or receive outside assistance during emergencies. New approaches to risk management must balance acceptable risk levels against the practical limitations of what can be achieved with current technology and reasonable costs. Mission abort criteria become meaningless when there's no safe haven to abort to and no rescue capability available. Traditional space missions can abort to Earth or safe orbit when problems develop, but lunar inhabitants must solve problems locally or face certain death. Emergency planning must focus on local problem resolution rather than evacuation, requiring capabilities and resources that far exceed those of temporary missions. Insurance and liability considerations for lunar operations reveal the unprecedented nature of the risks involved. No insurance company could accurately assess the probability of catastrophic failure when operating in completely untested conditions with experimental technology. The legal and financial frameworks for lunar operations don't exist, creating additional barriers to development beyond the technical challenges. These realities paint a picture of lunar colonization that's far more challenging and dangerous than most people realize. The moon isn't just another extreme environment like Antarctica or the deep ocean. It's a hostile alien world that actively threatens human survival in ways that push the absolute limits of our technology and endurance. Yet despite these seemingly insurmountable challenges, human ingenuity and determination continue to drive us toward this impossible goal. The question isn't whether we'll eventually overcome these obstacles, but whether we're willing to accept the enormous costs and risks involved in making the moon humanity's second home. The technological solutions being developed to address these challenges are simultaneously brilliant and terrifying in their complexity. Engineers are essentially trying to create a completely artificial Earth environment inside structures that must withstand conditions no building has ever faced. The radiation shielding alone requires innovations that push the boundaries of materials, science, and construction engineering. The leading approach involves burying habitats under massive amounts of lunar regolith, essentially creating underground cities beneath 80 centimeters of soil and rock. But excavating and moving that much material on the moon isn't like operating a bulldozer in your backyard. Every piece of equipment must function in vacuum, withstand temperature swings that would shatter most machinery, and operate remotely or through bulky spacesuits that limit human dexterity to that of someone wearing thick winter gloves while trying to perform surgery. The excavation equipment being designed looks more like something from a science fiction movie than traditional construction machinery. Robotic systems with hardened electronics, specialized cooling systems, and dust-proof sealing mechanisms that can operate continuously for months without maintenance. The energy requirements for such operations are staggering. Moving thousands of tons of regolith requires industrial-scale power generation in an environment where every kilowatt-hour must be carefully managed and conserved. But even if we solve the excavation challenge, we face the nightmare of constructing pressure vessels that can withstand both the internal forces from atmospheric pressure and the external loads from tons of soil. Traditional construction materials behave unpredictably in the lunar environment. Steel becomes brittle in extreme cold. Concrete can't cure properly without liquid water, and most polymers outgas toxic compounds in vacuum conditions. The solution engineers are developing involves a completely new category of construction material called lunar concrete, created by heating regolith to temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius and essentially melting it into a glass-like substance that can be shaped and cooled into structural elements. The process requires massive amounts of energy and equipment that must operate flawlessly in conditions that destroy most machinery within weeks. Solar concentrators using mirrors and lenses focus sunlight to achieve the necessary temperatures, but these systems must track the sun's movement across the lunar sky while maintaining precise focus despite dust accumulation and thermal expansion of the optical components. The manufacturing process creates its own hazards. including toxic fumes that could contaminate the habitat atmosphere and extreme heat that poses additional dangers to nearby equipment and personnel. Quality control for these locally manufactured structural components becomes a matter of life and death. Unlike Earth construction, where building codes provide safety margins for predictable loads and conditions, lunar structures face unknown stresses from thermal cycling, pressure differentials, and seismic activity from meteorite impacts. Every structural element must be tested to destruction to verify its properties. Yet the manufacturing capacity is so limited that destructive testing consumes precious materials that can't be easily replaced. The habitat design philosophy represents a complete departure from earthly architecture. Instead of designing buildings that interact with their environment, lunar habitats must completely isolate their interiors from the external world. Every surface that contacts the outside environment becomes a critical barrier where failure means death. Windows become engineering nightmares, requiring multiple layers of transparent materials that can withstand pressure differentials while maintaining optical clarity despite dust abrasion and radiation exposure. Airlock systems evolve into complex multi-chamber facilities that serve as decontamination centers, equipment storage areas, and emergency refuges. The simple concept of going outside becomes a complex procedure requiring suit checks, atmospheric transition protocols, and contamination control measures that can take hours to complete properly. The psychological impact of such restrictions on freedom of movement would be profound for people accustomed to simply opening a door and stepping outside. Life support system redundancy reaches levels that would be considered absurd in any terrestrial application. Every critical function requires not just backup systems, but backup systems for the backup systems. Air recycling equipment with triple redundancy means 3 complete atmospheric processing plants operating simultaneously, each capable of supporting the full population independently. The weight, power consumption, and maintenance requirements for such systems challenge the fundamental economics of lunar operations. Water recycling achieves efficiency levels that approach theoretical limits, recovering moisture from every possible source, including humidity condensation, waste processing, and even atmospheric scrubbing systems. The recycling processes involve multiple stages of filtration, chemical treatment, and purification that must operate continuously without creating toxic byproducts or consuming excessive energy. The psychological challenge of drinking water that has been recycled through every conceivable source adds another layer of stress to an already difficult existence. Atmospheric monitoring systems track hundreds of chemical compounds continuously, detecting trace gases that could accumulate to dangerous levels in the confined environment. Carbon monoxide from equipment operation, formaldehyde from material outgassing, and dozens of other potentially toxic substances require active removal through chemical scrubbing systems that must operate reliably for years without replacement components from Earth. Food production systems represent perhaps the most complex integration of technologies ever attempted in a hostile environment. Hydroponic and aeroponic growing systems must maintain precise nutrient delivery, atmospheric composition, and lighting conditions while operating in structures that experience extreme temperature cycling and constant vibration from life support equipment. The energy requirements for artificial lighting during the 2-week lunar night period consume enormous amounts of stored power. Plant growth in partial gravity environments remains largely unstudied, with unknown effects on root development, nutrient uptake, and fruit production. The absence of natural pollinators requires artificial pollination systems or genetically modified plants that can self-pollinate effectively. Pest control becomes critical when introducing any biological contamination could devastate closed agricultural systems. Yet traditional pesticides could contaminate the confined atmosphere of the habitat. Seed storage and genetic diversity preservation require sophisticated facilities that can maintain viable genetic material for years despite radiation exposure and temperature extremes. The loss of genetic diversity through crop failures or storage system malfunctions could permanently compromise food security with no possibility of resupply from Earth. Backup seed storage systems must operate independently with different preservation technologies to ensure survival through various failure scenarios. Medical facilities must provide capabilities equivalent to a modern hospital while operating with severely limited space, power, and personnel. Surgical suites require laminar flow systems to maintain sterile conditions, despite the constant presence of lunar dust throughout the habitat. Anesthesia delivery systems must account for the different physiological responses that may occur in partial gravity environments where fluid distribution and circulation patterns differ from Earth normal. Pharmaceutical production capabilities become essential for long-term missions when medication shelf lives expire and resupply from Earth is impossible or prohibitively expensive. Chemical synthesis equipment must produce everything from antibiotics to pain medications using raw materials that can be extracted from lunar resources or synthesized from basic chemical compounds. Quality control for locally produced medications requires analytical equipment and testing protocols that ensure safety and efficacy without the regulatory oversight available on Earth. Diagnostic equipment must provide comprehensive medical assessment capabilities while operating reliably in the harsh lunar environment. X-ray machines, ultrasound systems, blood analysis equipment, and other diagnostic tools face challenges from radiation effects, dust contamination, and temperature cycling that rapidly degrade sensitive electronic components. Calibration and maintenance of such equipment require specialized knowledge and replacement parts that may not be available locally. Emergency medical procedures take on new complexity when patient evacuation is impossible and specialist consultation is limited to delayed communication links with Earth. Every medical professional on a lunar base must possess skills spanning multiple specialties, from trauma surgery to psychiatric care. The psychological pressure of knowing that medical mistakes could be fatal when no additional help is available would be extraordinary for healthcare providers. Mental health support systems become critical infrastructure rather than optional services when psychological problems could affect mission safety and crew survival. Depression, anxiety, and cognitive impairment from isolation and stress must be detected early and treated effectively before they compromise individual performance or group dynamics. Automated monitoring systems using biometric sensors and behavioral analysis software could provide early warning of psychological problems. But such systems raise privacy concerns and may not be reliable enough for life-critical applications. Communication systems must maintain contact with Earth despite the Moon's rotation, which periodically blocks direct line-of-sight communication. Relay satellites in lunar orbit or communication stations on the far side of the Moon would be necessary for continuous contact, but such infrastructure represents additional complexity and cost that must be maintained remotely. Communication delays compound the isolation by making real-time conversation impossible, forcing all interactions into stilted exchanges that lack the natural flow of human communication. Data storage systems must preserve critical information despite radiation effects that can corrupt electronic memory over time. Multiple backup systems using different storage technologies would be necessary to ensure that technical manuals, medical databases, and operational procedures remain accessible despite equipment failures. The loss of critical information during an emergency could be catastrophic when Earth-based technical support is unavailable due to communication delays. Emergency procedures must account for scenarios that have no terrestrial equivalent, such as catastrophic pressure loss, life support system failures, or radiation exposure events. Evacuation protocols become meaningless when there's nowhere to evacuate to, forcing emergency planning to focus on local containment and repair rather than escape. Training for emergency procedures must prepare crews for situations where traditional emergency responses don't apply, and improvised solutions become matters of survival. Resource allocation systems must optimize the use of every material, component, and energy source while maintaining adequate reserves for emergencies. Computer modeling of resource consumption patterns must account for equipment failures, maintenance requirements, and unexpected demands that could quickly exhaust critical supplies. The logistics complexity exceeds that of major industrial facilities while operating with supply chains that extend across 240,000 miles of space. Waste processing systems must achieve near-perfect recycling efficiency when disposal options are non-existent and replacement materials are impossibly expensive to transport. Human waste processing must recover water and nutrients while safely disposing of toxic compounds and pathogens. Industrial waste from manufacturing and maintenance activities must be processed into useful materials or stored safely without contaminating the habitat environment. Manufacturing capabilities must span multiple industrial processes from electronics fabrication to pharmaceutical production, yet operate with minimal human oversight and maintenance support. Automated manufacturing systems must produce replacement parts, consumables, and even complex equipment using raw materials extracted from lunar regolith. The technical complexity of such systems approaches that of modern factories, while operating in conditions that destroy most industrial equipment rapidly. Quality assurance for locally manufactured items requires testing protocols that ensure reliability without wasting precious materials through destructive testing. Non-destructive testing equipment must verify component quality while operating reliably in the radiation and dust environment that affects all electronic systems. Statistical quality control becomes impossible when production volumes are small, and every component failure could have life-threatening consequences. Inventory management systems must track thousands of items while accounting for degradation rates, usage patterns, and emergency reserve requirements. Automated tracking systems using sensors and databases must operate continuously despite radiation effects on electronic systems. The loss of inventory data during equipment failures could compromise mission safety when crews lose track of critical supplies and spare parts. Transportation systems for moving people and materials around the lunar surface face unique challenges from the low-gravity environment and vacuum conditions. Pressurized rovers must provide life support while operating reliably in temperature extremes and dust conditions that rapidly degrade mechanical systems. Navigation becomes challenging when there are no landmarks, GPS systems, or atmospheric reference points to guide movement across the uniform grey landscape. Landing systems for cargo delivery from Earth must operate with precision that exceeds any current technology when targeting specific locations on the lunar surface. Automated landing systems must account for navigation errors, equipment failures, and changing surface conditions while carrying cargo too valuable to risk through imprecise delivery. Recovery systems for failed landings become impossible when cargo is scattered across inaccessible terrain or damaged beyond repair. Launch systems for returning cargo or personnel to Earth must operate from a surface with no infrastructure support and limited fuel resources. Rocket fuel production from lunar resources requires industrial-scale chemical processing facilities that must operate reliably despite the harsh environment. Fuel storage systems must prevent boil-off and contamination while maintaining precise mixture ratios for reliable engine performance. Construction equipment for building and expanding lunar facilities must operate autonomously or through remote control when human operators are limited by spacesuit restrictions and safety requirements. Robotic construction systems must perform complex assembly tasks with precision that exceeds human capabilities, while operating in conditions that rapidly degrade mechanical components. Equipment maintenance and repair must be performed by systems that can diagnose problems and implement solutions without human intervention. Power generation systems must provide reliable electricity despite the extreme day-night cycles and equipment degradation from radiation and dust exposure. Solar panel cleaning systems must remove dust accumulation without damaging the photovoltaic surfaces or consuming excessive water resources. Battery storage systems must operate through hundreds of charging cycles while experiencing temperature extremes that exceed the design limits of most electrochemical systems. Thermal management systems must maintain habitable temperatures while minimizing energy consumption during the extreme cold of the lunar night. Heat pumps and thermal storage systems must operate efficiently in vacuum conditions where conventional heat transfer mechanisms don't apply. Waste heat recovery from equipment operation must be maximized to reduce the energy requirements for heating during cold periods. Environmental control systems must maintain atmospheric pressure, composition, and quality while operating continuously for years without maintenance support from Earth. Atmospheric leakage detection and repair systems must identify and seal pressure leaks before they become catastrophic. Air filtration systems must remove dust particles, chemical contaminants, and biological agents while operating in the low-pressure environment of the habitat. Safety systems must prevent and respond to hazards that don't exist on Earth, such as explosive decompression, radiation exposure events, and equipment failures in vacuum conditions. Fire suppression systems must extinguish fires without producing toxic gases or damaging critical equipment in the confined atmosphere of the habitat. Emergency breathing apparatus must provide life support during atmospheric contamination events when the normal air supply becomes unsafe. Monitoring systems must track the performance and condition of thousands of components and systems while alerting operators to problems before they become critical. Predictive maintenance algorithms must analyze sensor data to identify equipment that's approaching failure before it actually fails. Diagnostic systems must provide detailed information about system malfunctions to enable repair by personnel with limited technical training and tool availability. The integration challenges for all these systems create a complexity that approaches the limits of human understanding and management capability. Every system interacts with every other system in ways that create unexpected failure modes and cascade effects. Computer modeling of such complex interactions requires computational resources and analytical capabilities that exceed what's currently available for system design and verification. Testing and validation of integrated systems becomes impossible when the complete system can't be tested on Earth under actual lunar conditions. Component-level testing in vacuum chambers and thermal cycling equipment can verify individual system performance, but system-level interactions can only be validated through actual deployment on the Moon. The risk of discovering critical integration problems after deployment could be catastrophic when there's no possibility of major system redesign or replacement. Training for lunar operations must prepare crews for scenarios that can't be fully simulated on Earth, where the low-gravity environment, psychological isolation, and equipment limitations create operational challenges that have never been experienced. Virtual reality training systems can simulate some aspects of lunar operations, but they can't replicate the stress, fatigue, and psychological effects of actually living in such an extreme environment. Mission planning must account for thousands of variables and contingencies while maintaining schedule flexibility for unexpected problems and delays. Resource allocation must balance competing priorities for power, materials, and human time while maintaining adequate reserves for emergencies. Risk management must assess probabilities for failure scenarios that have never occurred and develop mitigation strategies for problems that may have no solution. The cumulative effect of all these challenges creates a picture of lunar colonization that's far more difficult and dangerous than most people realize. Every aspect of human existence, from breathing and drinking water to sleeping and working, becomes a complex engineering challenge that must be solved with near-perfect reliability. The margin for error is essentially zero when equipment failures can quickly become life-threatening, and outside assistance is impossible. Yet, despite these overwhelming challenges, the drive to establish permanent human presence on the moon continues to motivate scientists, engineers, and explorers around the world. The technological solutions being developed push the boundaries of human capability and create innovations that could benefit life on Earth as well. The question isn't whether the challenges are surmountable, but whether humanity has the determination and resources to overcome obstacles that represent the ultimate test of our species' ingenuity and perseverance. The economic realities of lunar colonization add another dimension of impossibility that often gets overlooked in discussions of technical challenges. Current launch costs make transporting even basic supplies to the moon prohibitively expensive for any sustainable operation. A single kilogram of cargo costs tens of thousands of dollars to deliver to lunar orbit, and landing systems add additional expense and complexity. When you calculate the mass requirements for a permanent lunar base, including habitats, life support equipment, manufacturing systems, and consumable supplies, you're looking at transportation costs that could exceed the gross domestic product of most nations. The resource extraction industry needed to support lunar colonization would require rebuilding entire sectors of human civilization in an environment that destroys industrial equipment faster than it can be replaced. Mining operations on the moon face challenges that make terrestrial mining look like sandbox play. The regolith contains useful materials, but extracting them requires processes that consume enormous amounts of energy while operating in conditions no industrial equipment has ever been designed to handle. Water extraction from polar ice deposits represents the most critical resource challenge. The permanently shadowed regions where ice exists maintain temperatures around -230 degrees Celsius, colder than liquid nitrogen. Mining equipment must operate in these conditions while providing enough heat to sublimate ice directly from solid to vapor without melting it first. The energy requirements are staggering. Every gram of water extracted requires heating several kilograms of surrounding regolith, and the extraction equipment itself consumes power just to prevent its own components from freezing solid. The mining process creates additional complications that compound over time. As extraction operations remove surface ice, the remaining deposits become deeper and harder to reach. The thermal insulation properties of lunar regolith mean that heating surface layers actually makes it more difficult to reach underlying ice deposits. It's like trying to melt ice at the bottom of a thermos bottle while the insulation keeps getting thicker with each attempt. Oxygen extraction from lunar regolith requires even more extreme processing conditions. The most common approach involves heating ilmenite-rich regolith to over 1000 degrees Celsius in the presence of hydrogen gas, creating water vapor that can then be electrolyzed to produce oxygen and hydrogen. This process requires industrial furnaces operating at temperatures that challenge the limits of materials science while consuming power equivalent to small cities. The hydrogen needed for this process must either be shipped from Earth at enormous cost or produced locally through water electrolysis, creating a circular dependency where you need water to make oxygen, but need oxygen to sustain the operations that extract water. The energy balance becomes a complex optimization problem where every inefficiency compounds into system-threatening power shortages. Metal extraction from lunar regolith faces similar energy constraints, multiplied by the complexity of separating useful metals from the complex mineral matrix of lunar soil. Iron can be extracted using magnetic separation techniques, but aluminum, titanium, and other essential metals require chemical processing at high temperatures, with reagents that must be produced locally or shipped from Earth. Each processing step requires specialized equipment that must operate reliably in vacuum conditions while consuming significant power and producing waste products that must be safely handled. The scale of industrial operations needed to supply a lunar base approaches that of major terrestrial mining operations, yet everything must be designed to operate autonomously with minimal human oversight. Automated mining equipment must diagnose its own problems, perform its own maintenance, and adapt to changing conditions without the technical support infrastructure that terrestrial operations take for granted. When a mining truck breaks down in an Earth operation, you call for a repair crew. On the Moon, the equipment must fix itself or the entire operation stops. Quality control for extracted materials becomes critical when impurities could contaminate life support systems or compromise structural integrity. Terrestrial mining operations can tolerate significant impurities that are removed during subsequent processing steps. But lunar operations must produce materials that meet aerospace-grade specifications using equipment that operates in conditions designed to destroy precision machinery. Analytical equipment for testing material quality must operate reliably despite radiation exposure and dust contamination that rapidly degrade sensitive instruments. Transportation of extracted materials from mining sites to processing facilities requires logistics networks that operate efficiently in the low-gravity vacuum environment. Conveyor systems don't work properly when materials behave differently than on Earth. And traditional trucking operations require pressurized vehicles that can navigate terrain with no roads or landmarks. Autonomous navigation systems must operate without GPS or atmospheric reference points while avoiding hazards that could disable vehicles hundreds of kilometers from any repair facility. Processing facilities for converting raw materials into useful products require industrial chemistry capabilities that rival major petrochemical complexes, while operating in an environment that makes such operations nearly impossible. Chemical reactors must maintain precise temperature and pressure conditions despite external temperature swings of hundreds of degrees. Catalyst systems must operate efficiently despite radiation damage that degrades their effectiveness over time. Process control systems must maintain product quality automatically, since human operators have limited ability to intervene during equipment malfunctions. The manufacturing supply chain stretches across multiple processing steps, each with its own failure points and quality requirements. Raw regolith must be mined, transported, processed into intermediate products, refined into finished materials, and finally manufactured into useful components. Every step requires energy, equipment, and human oversight, while operating in conditions that challenge the fundamental assumptions of industrial engineering. A single failure anywhere in this chain can shut down operations that took months or years to establish. Waste management from industrial operations creates environmental challenges that have no terrestrial equivalent. Slag and tailings from metal extraction can't be simply dumped in convenient locations because they could contaminate water extraction sites or interfere with construction activities. Chemical waste from processing operations must be neutralized or stored safely without creating long-term environmental hazards. Even seemingly harmless waste heat from industrial operations must be managed carefully to prevent thermal pollution that could affect nearby equipment or habitats. The integration between resource extraction and habitat operations creates dependencies that multiply the risk of cascade failures. Power systems must prioritize life support over industrial operations during emergencies, but shutting down extraction equipment could cause process upsets that damage expensive systems. Water production must meet both life support requirements and industrial cooling needs, but equipment failures in either system could compromise both operations. The complexity of managing these interdependencies exceeds anything attempted in terrestrial operations. Economic modeling of lunar resource extraction reveals cost structures that challenge the fundamental viability of lunar colonization. The capital investment required to establish extraction and processing capabilities approaches the cost of major infrastructure projects like transcontinental railways or space programs. Operating costs remain high due to equipment replacement requirements and energy consumption that far exceeds terrestrial operations. Even optimistic projections suggest that lunar-produced materials would cost hundreds of times more than equivalent Earth-produced materials for decades after initial operations begin. The business case for lunar resources depends entirely on the assumption that transportation costs from Earth remain prohibitively high, while lunar operations achieve efficiency levels that have never been demonstrated in any comparable terrestrial operation. If launch costs decrease significantly through technological advances, the economic justification for lunar resource extraction could disappear entirely, leaving expensive infrastructure stranded without viable markets for its products. International law governing lunar resource extraction remains largely undefined, creating legal uncertainties that complicate investment decisions and operational planning. The Outer Space Treaty prohibits national appropriation of celestial bodies, but doesn't clearly address resource extraction rights or environmental protection requirements. Conflicting national legislation creates regulatory frameworks that may not be compatible with international cooperation requirements for major lunar development projects. Environmental protection on the Moon presents unique challenges when human activities could permanently alter a pristine environment that has remained unchanged for billions of years. Dust clouds from landing operations and industrial activities could contaminate scientific sites or interfere with astronomical observations from lunar telescopes. Chemical emissions from industrial processes could accumulate in the thin lunar atmosphere and create long-term pollution that affects future operations. The scientific value of lunar resources extends beyond their utility for supporting human operations. Lunar samples contain information about the early solar system that could be destroyed through large-scale industrial processing. Balancing the need for resource extraction with the preservation of scientific sites requires careful planning and international cooperation that may be difficult to achieve when economic interests conflict with scientific priorities. Research and development costs for lunar resource extraction technologies represent major investments that must be made years before any return on investment becomes possible. The technological risks are enormous since many critical systems can't be fully tested on Earth under actual lunar conditions. Development timelines stretch over decades, while costs compound due to the need for multiple design iterations and extensive testing programs. Private investors face uncertainty about technological feasibility, regulatory frameworks, and market demand that makes traditional business planning nearly impossible. The skilled workforce needed to operate lunar extraction facilities requires training programs that don't currently exist and may not be practical to implement. Operations personnel need expertise spanning multiple engineering disciplines while being capable of working in extreme isolation under life-threatening conditions. The psychological screening and training requirements would eliminate most potential candidates, creating human resource constraints that could limit operational capacity regardless of technological capabilities. Logistics support for lunar operations requires supply chains that span interplanetary distances, with delivery schedules measured in months rather than days. Critical spare parts and consumables must be ordered years in advance, based on predictive maintenance schedules that may not account for the accelerated equipment degradation in lunar conditions. Emergency resupply operations face the same transportation cost and scheduling constraints that make routine operations economically challenging. Safety regulations for lunar industrial operations don't exist and would need to be developed through international cooperation among space agencies and regulatory bodies. Traditional industrial safety standards assume the availability of emergency response capabilities that don't exist on the Moon. Worker protection requirements in vacuum environments exceed anything currently regulated for terrestrial operations. The liability frameworks for industrial accidents on the Moon would need to address scenarios where rescue operations are impossible and accidents could be fatal to entire crews. Technology transfer from lunar operations back to Earth could provide economic benefits that partially offset the enormous development costs. But such benefits remain speculative until the technologies are actually developed and proven in operational environments. Advanced materials processing techniques developed for lunar conditions might find applications in terrestrial industries, but the market value of such innovations is impossible to predict accurately. Intellectual property frameworks for technologies developed through international cooperation on lunar projects remain undefined and could create disputes that complicate future development efforts. The timeline for achieving economic viability of lunar resource extraction stretches across multiple decades under the most optimistic scenarios. Initial operations would focus on producing consumables for lunar bases themselves, with export to Earth or other space operations becoming viable only after local demand is satisfied and production scales increase dramatically. The investment required to reach economically viable production levels exceeds the financial capabilities of individual companies or even most national space programs. Competition between different approaches to lunar resource utilization could fragment development efforts and delay progress toward economically viable operations. In situ, resource utilization competes with transportation of materials from Earth, asteroid mining, and alternative space-based manufacturing approaches. Investment decisions must account for technological developments in competing approaches that could make lunar resources obsolete before operations become profitable. The environmental consequences of large-scale lunar resource extraction could permanently alter the Moon's appearance and scientific value. Surface mining operations would create visible scars that could be seen from Earth, changing humanity's relationship with its nearest celestial neighbor. Atmospheric contamination from industrial operations could interfere with astronomical observations and scientific research for generations. The irreversible nature of such changes requires careful consideration of whether short-term resource needs justify permanent alteration of the lunar environment. Public support for lunar resource extraction faces challenges from environmental groups, scientific organizations, and taxpayers concerned about the enormous costs and uncertain benefits. Political sustainability of long-term development programs requires maintaining public support through multiple election cycles and changing administrations. International cooperation agreements face similar challenges as domestic political priorities change and economic conditions affect national space program budgets. The strategic implications of a lunar resource control could create geopolitical tensions that complicate international cooperation, while potentially triggering conflicts over access to critical resources. Nations that develop early capabilities for lunar resource extraction could gain advantages in space-based activities that affect terrestrial economic and military competition. Arms control agreements would need to address the dual-use nature of technologies that could support both civilian resource extraction and military space operations. Alternative approaches to supporting lunar operations, such as improved transportation systems or closed-loop life support technologies, could eliminate the need for large-scale resource extraction while providing more reliable and cost-effective solutions. Technological developments in these alternative approaches could make resource extraction investments obsolete before they achieve profitability. Investment strategies must account for the possibility that different technological paths could provide better solutions to the challenges of lunar operations. The fundamental question remains whether lunar resource extraction represents a necessary step towards sustainable space development or an expensive detour that diverts resources from more practical approaches to space exploration and utilization. The enormous costs and technical challenges suggest that alternative strategies might achieve the same goals more efficiently while avoiding the environmental and political complications of large-scale lunar industrial operations. Yet, the potential benefits of establishing sustainable resource extraction capabilities could justify the investments if the technologies prove successful and economically viable over the extremely long timelines required for such development. These economic and environmental realities add yet another layer of impossibility to the already overwhelming technical challenges of lunar colonization. The moon isn't just hostile to human life, it's hostile to human economics, environmental stewardship, and international cooperation. Every aspect of establishing permanent human presence there pushes against the practical limits of what our species can achieve with current technology and social organization. The question becomes not just whether we can overcome these challenges, but whether we should attempt to do so when alternative approaches might serve humanity's space exploration goals more effectively and sustainably. Yet perhaps the most sobering reality of all is that we're essentially planning to conduct the largest and most dangerous human experiment in history with absolutely no way to predict the outcome. Every aspect of lunar colonization pushes into uncharted territory, where our best scientific models and engineering calculations become educated guesses at best. Consider the simple act of human reproduction in a lunar environment. We have absolutely no data on how human pregnancy and fetal development would proceed in 1/6 gravity with constant radiation exposure. Animal studies suggest that embryonic development could be severely compromised, but we're talking about potentially irreversible changes to human biology that could affect generations of lunar-born children. The ethical implications of essentially using human beings as test subjects for reproductive experiments are staggering. Bone density loss in partial gravity environments could fundamentally alter human physiology over generational timescales. Children born and raised on the moon might develop skeletal structures that are completely adapted to low-gravity conditions, making them physically incapable of ever visiting Earth. We're potentially creating a branch of humanity that would be permanently separated from their ancestral home planet by the basic laws of physics and biology. The neurological effects of prolonged low-gravity exposure remain completely unknown. The human brain developed under Earth's gravitational influence, and the fluid dynamics that govern everything from blood flow to inner ear balance could be permanently altered by lunar conditions. Cognitive development in children raised in partial gravity might follow completely different patterns, creating psychological and intellectual differences that we can't predict or prepare for. Radiation exposure during critical developmental periods could cause genetic mutations that affect not just individuals, but their offspring for generations to come. The moon offers no protection from cosmic rays and solar radiation that could damage DNA in ways that compound over time. We're essentially proposing to expose human populations to radiation levels that would be considered catastrophic on Earth, with no clear understanding of the long-term genetic consequences. The psychological development of children raised in the confined artificial environment of a lunar base presents challenges that go far beyond anything studied in terrestrial psychology. These children would never experience weather, never see wild animals, never feel wind or rain, never witness the changing of seasons. The psychological impact of such sensory deprivation during critical developmental years could create cognitive and emotional patterns that we can't predict or correct. Social development in tiny, isolated communities creates additional concerns about genetic diversity and cultural evolution. small populations face inevitable inbreeding problems that could compound genetic issues from radiation exposure. Cultural stagnation in isolated communities could lead to social structures and belief systems that diverge dramatically from Earth-based human civilization. We're potentially creating isolated human societies that could evolve in directions that we can't anticipate or control. The medical research needed to understand these biological and psychological challenges would require decades of study before we could ethically consider permanent lunar settlements. Yet, the pressure to establish lunar presence for geopolitical and economic reasons creates incentives to proceed before the science is complete. We're essentially being asked to make irreversible decisions about human evolution and development based on incomplete information and theoretical models. Emergency medical protocols for treating conditions that don't exist on Earth become impossible to develop without actual experience treating patients in lunar conditions. Space medicine has some experience with short-term effects of microgravity, but the combination of partial gravity, radiation exposure, and psychological stress creates a medical environment that's completely unprecedented. Doctors on lunar bases would be practicing medicine in conditions where established medical knowledge may not apply, and treatment protocols would need to be developed through trial and error with human lives at stake. Pharmaceutical effectiveness could change dramatically in lunar conditions, where human physiology, metabolism, and drug absorption patterns might be altered by gravity and radiation effects. Medications that work perfectly on Earth could become ineffective or even toxic in lunar environments. The time required to research and test pharmaceutical protocols for lunar conditions would span decades, yet medical emergencies wouldn't wait for research completion. Surgical procedures face complications that go far beyond the technical challenges of operating in low gravity. Blood circulation patterns change in partial gravity environments, affecting everything from anesthesia distribution to wound healing. Surgical instruments designed for Earth gravity don't behave predictably when objects have different weight and momentum characteristics. Post-operative recovery could follow completely different timelines when the body's healing mechanisms are operating under alien gravitational conditions. Mental health treatment becomes exponentially more complex when the environmental stresses that contribute to psychological problems are permanent and inescapable. Traditional therapeutic approaches assume that patients can eventually return to normal environments, but lunar inhabitants would face the reality that their stressful, dangerous, and isolated conditions are permanent life circumstances. Treatment protocols would need to help people adapt to psychological stresses that would be considered intolerable in any terrestrial environment. The research infrastructure needed to study these medical and psychological challenges would require capabilities that approach those of major medical centers, while operating in conditions that make such facilities nearly impossible to maintain. Laboratory equipment for studying physiological changes must operate reliably despite radiation effects and dust contamination. Research protocols must account for small population sizes that make statistical analysis difficult, while ethical considerations prevent many types of experimental studies. Data collection and analysis become critical when research findings could affect the survival of entire lunar populations. Yet the communication delays and limited computational resources available on lunar bases would severely constrain research capabilities. Medical databases and research libraries would need to be maintained locally, despite the storage and computational challenges of preserving large amounts of digital information in radiation-rich environments. The consent and ethics frameworks for medical research on lunar populations face unprecedented challenges when research subjects have no option to leave the study environment and return to normal conditions. Traditional medical research ethics assume that participants can withdraw from studies and return to their normal lives, but lunar inhabitants would be permanent research subjects in an environment that affects every aspect of their physiology and psychology. the ethical implications of such permanent medical experimentation are staggering. International oversight of lunar medical research would be complicated by the jurisdictional questions about which nations' medical ethics standards apply to international lunar facilities. Medical research protocols developed through international cooperation would need to satisfy the ethical requirements of multiple countries while operating in conditions that challenge the basic assumptions of terrestrial medical ethics. The regulatory frameworks for such international medical research don't exist and would need to be developed through complex diplomatic negotiations. The liability and insurance implications of medical research and treatment on lunar bases exceed anything covered by terrestrial legal and insurance systems. Medical malpractice in conditions where evacuation is impossible and treatment protocols are experimental creates liability exposures that no insurance company could accurately assess. Legal frameworks for addressing medical negligence when patients can't be transferred to alternative care facilities would need to be developed specifically for lunar operations. Training requirements for medical personnel on lunar bases would exceed anything required for terrestrial medical practice. Every medical professional would need expertise spanning multiple specialties while being capable of developing new treatment protocols for conditions that don't exist on Earth. The breadth of knowledge and experience required approaches the limits of what individual humans can master. Yet the small population of lunar bases would require such comprehensive medical expertise from every healthcare provider. The psychological burden on medical personnel would be extraordinary when treatment failures could affect the survival of entire communities and evacuation options don't exist. Medical decisions that would be routine on Earth become life or death choices when alternative treatment options are limited and specialist consultation is delayed by communication constraints. The stress of practicing medicine under such conditions could affect the judgment and performance of healthcare providers in ways that compound medical risks. Research collaboration between lunar and Earth-based medical facilities would be severely constrained by communication delays that make real-time consultation impossible. Complex medical cases that would benefit from specialist input must be managed with delayed advice that may not account for rapidly changing patient conditions. Telemedicine technologies would need to operate reliably despite the technical challenges of maintaining high-quality communication links across interplanetary distances. Medical supply chains face challenges that exceed those of any terrestrial medical facility when critical medications and equipment must be ordered months or years in advance based on predicted medical needs. Emergency medical supplies can't be delivered quickly when supply routes span hundreds of thousands of miles, and delivery schedules are measured in months rather than hours. Medical inventory management must account for expiration dates, storage degradation, and usage patterns that are impossible to predict accurately. The cumulative medical risks of lunar colonization create probability calculations that become increasingly sobering as mission duration extends beyond short-term visits toward permanent settlement. The mathematical likelihood of experiencing at least one major medical emergency increases dramatically with population size and mission duration, approaching certainty for permanent settlements. Risk mitigation strategies must account for medical scenarios that could affect entire populations when evacuation and resupply options are severely limited. Quarantine protocols for preventing disease transmission in closed populations become critical when infectious diseases could spread rapidly through entire lunar communities with no possibility of external medical assistance. Disease prevention strategies must achieve effectiveness levels that exceed anything required in terrestrial environments while operating with limited diagnostic and treatment resources. Vaccination programs must provide protection against diseases that might be introduced through cargo shipments or personnel transfers, while accounting for vaccine storage and efficacy challenges in radiation-rich environments. The genetic monitoring requirements for detecting radiation-induced mutations would require capabilities that approach those of major genetic research centers, while operating in conditions that make such facilities nearly impossible to maintain. Genetic screening programs must detect mutations that could affect not just individuals, but their offspring for generations to come. The computational and analytical resources needed for genetic monitoring exceed what could practically be maintained on lunar bases, yet the health consequences of failing to detect genetic damage could be catastrophic for future generations. Reproductive medicine faces challenges that go far beyond the technical difficulties of providing obstetric and gynecological care in lunar conditions. Family planning decisions become existential questions. When children born on the Moon might be physically incapable of ever visiting Earth due to physiological adaptations to low-gravity environments. Genetic counseling must address risks that are impossible to quantify accurately while helping families make irreversible decisions about their genetic legacy. Pediatric medicine would require capabilities that don't currently exist for treating children whose development follows patterns that have never been studied or understood. Childhood diseases that are routine on Earth could follow completely different courses in lunar conditions where immune system development, nutrition, and environmental stresses are unlike anything experienced in terrestrial medicine. Treatment protocols would need to be developed through direct experience with pediatric patients whose conditions might not respond to established medical knowledge. Mental health services for children and adolescents would face the challenge of promoting healthy psychological development in environments that would be considered psychologically harmful by any terrestrial standard. Childhood development requires exposure to natural environments, social diversity, and cultural experiences that simply don't exist on the Moon. Mental health professionals would essentially be asked to help children adapt to psychological conditions that would be considered abusive if imposed on Earth-based populations. Educational systems for lunar-born children would need to provide comprehensive knowledge about Earth-based human civilization, while preparing students for life in conditions that bear no resemblance to the environments where human culture and knowledge developed. Language development could be affected by the limited social interactions available in small, isolated communities. Cultural transmission becomes problematic when traditional human cultural practices don't apply to lunar living conditions. The long-term sustainability of human consciousness and culture in lunar environments raises philosophical questions that go beyond practical considerations of survival and reproduction. Human psychology, creativity, and cultural development evolved in response to Earth's environmental conditions and social structures. Whether human consciousness can maintain its essential characteristics when permanently separated from terrestrial environments remains an open question with profound implications for the future of human civilization. Legal frameworks for governing lunar-born populations would need to address citizenship, rights, and responsibilities for people who might never visit Earth, while potentially being physiologically incapable of surviving in terrestrial environments. International law provides no guidance for addressing the legal status of permanent spaceborne populations, who might develop into separate human subspecies with different physiological and psychological characteristics. The ethical obligations of current human generations toward lunar-born populations raise questions about consent and responsibility that have no precedent in human history. We would essentially be making irreversible decisions about human evolution and development that would affect people who have no voice in those decisions and no alternative to the conditions we create for them. The moral weight of such decisions challenges our fundamental concepts of human rights and intergenerational responsibility. Cultural preservation efforts would face the challenge of maintaining human cultural heritage in environments where traditional cultural practices become impossible or meaningless. Art, music, literature, and religious practices developed in response to Earth environments and social conditions that don't exist on the Moon. Whether human culture can adapt to lunar conditions while maintaining its essential characteristics remains an open question with implications for human identity and meaning. Research ethics for studying lunar-born populations would require frameworks that don't currently exist for addressing research on human populations who are essentially permanent research subjects in experimental environments. Traditional research ethics assume that study populations can withdraw from research and return to normal conditions. But lunar inhabitants would be permanent subjects in an ongoing experiment in human adaptation to alien environments. The philosophical implications of creating separate human populations adapted to different planetary environments raise questions about human unity and species identity that challenge our fundamental concepts of what it means to be human. Whether lunar-adapted humans would remain part of the same species as Earth-based humans depends on biological and evolutionary factors that we can't predict or control. We're potentially initiating human speciation events that could permanently divide our species into separate evolutionary paths. The responsibility for failures in lunar colonization attempts extends beyond the immediate participants to affect humanity's entire relationship with space exploration and development. Catastrophic failures that result in loss of life could set back human space exploration efforts for generations, while creating political and cultural barriers to future attempts. The stakes of lunar colonization extend far beyond the success or failure of individual missions to affect humanity's long-term future as a spacefaring species. Time pressure for lunar development, driven by geopolitical competition and resource concerns, creates incentives to proceed before adequate safety measures and research protections are in place. International competition for lunar resources and strategic advantages could drive rushed development timelines that increase risks for initial lunar populations, while potentially compromising the long-term viability of lunar settlements. The pressure to achieve political and economic objectives could override scientific and ethical considerations that should govern such unprecedented human experiments. The irreversible nature of many decisions about lunar colonization means that mistakes in planning or implementation could have permanent consequences for human populations and human evolution. Unlike most human endeavors, where failures can be corrected through subsequent efforts, many aspects of lunar colonization involve irreversible changes to human biology, psychology, and culture. The margin for error approaches zero when the consequences of failure could affect human evolution for generations to come. Alternative approaches to achieving space exploration and resource utilization goals might provide safer and more ethical paths toward expanding human presence in space, while avoiding the enormous risks and uncertainties of permanent lunar colonization. Robotic exploration, temporary research stations, and asteroid mining could achieve many of the same scientific and economic objectives without exposing human populations to the unprecedented risks of permanent settlement in such hostile environments. The fundamental question underlying all these considerations is whether the potential benefits of lunar colonization justify exposing human beings to risks that exceed anything our species has ever faced while conducting experiments that could permanently alter human evolution and culture. The Moon represents not just a hostile environment that challenges human survival, but an experimental laboratory where we would be testing the absolute limits of human adaptability with consequences that could echo through all future human history. Every aspect of lunar colonization, from the basic challenges of staying alive to the profound implications for human evolution, pushes against the boundaries of what our species can achieve, while forcing us to confront fundamental questions about human nature, ethics, and our responsibilities to future generations. The Moon isn't just trying to kill us physically, it's challenging our deepest concepts of what it means to be human, and whether our species has the wisdom to undertake such unprecedented experiments with human life and evolution. The weight of these realities creates a picture of lunar colonization that's simultaneously inspiring and terrifying, representing both the ultimate expression of human courage and ingenuity and the most dangerous gamble our species has ever contemplated. Whether we proceed with such efforts depends not just on our technological capabilities, but on our wisdom in recognizing when the costs and risks exceed what any reasonable assessment of benefits could justify. The moon awaits, hostile and unforgiving, ready to test every aspect of human capability and determination in ways that will define our species' future among the stars. The stars. Yet here's what makes this entire discussion even more chilling. We're not just talking about the people brave enough or foolish enough to volunteer for these missions. We're talking about their children and their children's children. Because once you establish permanent human presence on the moon, you're not just creating a settlement. You're potentially creating an entirely new branch of human evolution that could be cut off from Earth forever. Think about what that really means. A child born on the moon would develop in 1/6 gravity from the moment of conception. Their bones would grow differently. Their muscles would develop differently. Their entire cardiovascular system would adapt to an environment that's fundamentally alien to human biology. After spending their formative years in partial gravity, they might literally be unable to survive on Earth. The planet where their species evolved could become physically uninhabitable for them. We're essentially talking about creating the first generation of humans who would be permanent exiles from their own home planet. Not by choice, not by circumstance, but by biology. Their bodies would adapt so completely to lunar conditions that returning to Earth could be impossible. Imagine the psychological weight of that reality. Looking up at the blue and green world where all of human history unfolded, knowing that you can never go there because your own physiology has become incompatible with your species' birthplace. The reproductive biology questions become even more disturbing when you consider that we have absolutely no idea whether human reproduction would even work properly in lunar conditions. The combination of radiation exposure and partial gravity could affect everything from fertility rates to embryonic development in ways we can't predict. Animal studies suggest that pregnancy outcomes could be severely compromised, but we're talking about conducting essentially the largest human reproductive experiment in history with no control group and no way to reverse the consequences. And that's assuming reproduction works at all. The radiation environment alone could cause genetic damage that accumulates across generations, potentially leading to birth defects, developmental disorders, or genetic diseases that don't exist on Earth. We'd be exposing human populations to radiation levels that would be considered catastrophic in any terrestrial environment, with no clear understanding of how those exposures would affect not just individuals, but their genetic legacy for generations to come. The social implications are equally staggering. Lunar colonies would necessarily start with very small populations, perhaps a few dozen people at most. The genetic bottleneck effect could create inbreeding problems within just a few generations, especially if the harsh environment leads to high mortality rates that further reduce the effective breeding population. We're potentially setting up conditions for genetic disasters that could doom any attempt at sustainable human presence. But let's say we somehow overcome all the biological challenges. Let's imagine that human reproduction works, that genetic diversity remains adequate, that children develop normally in partial gravity. We're still creating human societies that would be unlike anything in our species' history. These would be closed communities where every person's survival depends on perfect cooperation and system maintenance, where any individual's mistake could kill everyone, where psychological pressure and isolation exceed anything humans have ever experienced. The psychological development of children in such environments raises questions that keep child psychologists awake at night. Human childhood development requires exposure to nature, to weather patterns, to animals, to the changing of seasons. Lunar children would experience none of this. They'd grow up in artificial environments where the sky is always black, where there's no wind or rain or snow, where the only sounds are the mechanical hum of life support systems keeping them alive. What kind of human consciousness would develop under such conditions? Would lunar-born humans think differently than Earth humans? Would they develop different concepts of beauty, meaning, purpose? Would they even remain recognizably human in their psychology and culture? Or would isolation and environmental pressure create something fundamentally different? The cultural transmission problems become apparent when you realize that human culture developed in response to Earth environments and conditions. Our literature, music, art, and philosophy all draw on experiences of weather, seasons, natural landscapes, and biological diversity that simply don't exist on the moon. How do you explain the concept of rain to someone who has never seen clouds? How do you convey the beauty of a forest to someone who has never seen a living tree? Traditional human knowledge about agriculture, animal husbandry, natural medicine, and countless other aspects of human culture would become completely irrelevant to lunar populations. They'd need to develop entirely new cultural frameworks for understanding their relationship with their environment, their purpose, and their place in the universe. We're essentially creating conditions where human culture would need to evolve as rapidly and dramatically as human biology. The educational challenges for lunar children would be unprecedented. They'd need to learn about Earth-based human civilization and history while living in conditions that make none of that knowledge directly applicable to their daily lives. How do you teach geography to children who live on a world with no oceans, no continents, no weather systems? How do you explain Earth's political systems to people who must live in tiny closed communities where survival depends on perfect cooperation? Language development could be affected by the limited social interactions available in small, isolated communities. Children might develop simplified language patterns, or miss crucial aspects of human communication that require exposure to diverse social groups and cultural contexts. The richness of human language could be lost in environments where survival needs dominate all other considerations. The legal and ethical frameworks for governing these populations don't exist and would need to be created from scratch. What rights do lunar-born humans have? What nations' laws apply to people who might never set foot on Earth? How do you handle crime and punishment in communities where banishment means death and imprisonment affects the survival of everyone? The traditional concepts of human rights and legal protections assume access to alternative environments and communities that wouldn't exist on the moon. International cooperation becomes essential for lunar colonies, yet the history of human cooperation in extreme environments suggests that such cooperation often breaks down under stress. Antarctic research stations, despite being temporary and having evacuation options, regularly experience interpersonal conflicts and psychological problems. Permanent lunar settlements would face similar stresses, multiplied by the knowledge that conflicts can't be resolved through separation or evacuation. The governance structures for lunar colonies would need to balance individual rights with collective survival needs in ways that challenge fundamental principles of human freedom and autonomy. In terrestrial societies, individual freedom is balanced against collective needs through complex legal and social systems that assume people can leave communities that become oppressive. On the moon, leaving isn't an option. The community you're born into becomes your entire world, potentially for your entire life. Emergency planning for catastrophic failures takes on existential weight when entire human populations could be lost with no possibility of rescue or evacuation. Unlike Earth disasters where survivors can flee to other regions and rebuild, lunar catastrophes could result in the complete extinction of human populations, with no hope of outside assistance. Emergency plans must account for scenarios where entire communities could be wiped out in minutes, taking with them unique human cultures and genetic lineages that could never be recovered. The psychological burden on the first generation of lunar colonists would be extraordinary. They'd know that they're conducting experiments with human life and evolution that could affect all future human history. Every decision they make about child rearing, education, culture, and community organization would set precedents that could influence human development for generations. The weight of such responsibility could be psychologically crushing for people already dealing with the stress of survival in the most hostile environment humans have ever attempted to inhabit. Communication with Earth would provide some connection to human civilization, but the delays and limited bandwidth would make real cultural exchange nearly impossible. Lunar populations would inevitably begin developing their own cultural practices, social norms, and ways of understanding the world that diverge from Earth-based human culture. Over time, they could become as culturally distinct from Earth humans as isolated human populations have become throughout history, but with the added factor of complete physical separation and environmental pressure. The religious and philosophical implications challenge fundamental human concepts about our place in the universe and our relationship with the natural world. Human spirituality and philosophy developed in response to Earth's environments and natural cycles that don't exist on the Moon. How do lunar populations develop concepts of meaning, purpose, and transcendence when their entire existence is focused on the mechanical requirements of staying alive in an artificial environment? Scientific research conducted by lunar populations would necessarily focus on survival-related technologies and local resource utilization, rather than the broader scientific questions that drive human curiosity and understanding. The cultural tradition of scientific inquiry for its own sake might be lost when all intellectual resources must be devoted to practical survival needs. The narrowing of human intellectual horizons could affect not just lunar populations, but humanity's overall capacity for scientific and philosophical advancement. The long-term sustainability of human consciousness and creativity in such constrained environments raises questions about whether essential human characteristics can survive under conditions of extreme environmental pressure and social isolation. Human creativity, imagination, and intellectual curiosity evolved in response to complex, varied environments that provided endless sources of inspiration and challenge. Whether these characteristics can be maintained in the sterile, repetitive environment of lunar habitats remains an open question. Medical research on lunar populations would necessarily be conducted on people who have no option to withdraw from the study and return to normal conditions. Every lunar inhabitant would be a permanent research subject in an ongoing experiment in human adaptation to alien environments. The ethical implications of such permanent experimentation challenge fundamental principles of medical research ethics and human rights that assume people can choose whether to participate in experimental conditions. The genetic monitoring required to track radiation-induced mutations and evolutionary changes would require capabilities that approach those of major genetic research centers, while operating in conditions that make such facilities nearly impossible to maintain. Yet failing to monitor genetic changes could result in missing critical health problems that affect not just individuals but entire population lineages. The computational and analytical resources needed for comprehensive genetic monitoring exceed what could practically be maintained on lunar bases. Reproductive medicine would face the challenge of providing obstetric and genetic counseling for conditions that have never been studied or understood. Family planning decisions become questions about human evolution and species development when children might be born with genetic or physiological characteristics that are unknown and potentially irreversible. Parents would be making reproductive decisions based on incomplete information about risks that could affect their children and all subsequent generations. The preservation of human genetic diversity becomes a critical concern when small populations face environmental pressures that could select for specific genetic traits while eliminating others. Genetic bottlenecks in lunar populations could result in the loss of genetic variants that are important for human health and adaptability, permanently reducing the genetic diversity of human populations. The genetic consequences of lunar colonization could affect not just lunar populations, but the entire human species if genetic exchange between Earth and lunar populations becomes limited. Cultural preservation efforts would face the impossible task of maintaining the full richness of human cultural heritage in environments where most traditional cultural practices become meaningless or impossible. The vast majority of human cultural knowledge, from traditional crafts and skills to religious practices and social customs, developed in response to Earth environments and wouldn't apply to lunar conditions. Future generations of lunar humans might lose touch with cultural traditions that have defined human civilization for thousands of years. The technological dependence of lunar populations would be absolute in ways that no human society has ever experienced. Every aspect of survival, from breathing air to drinking water, would depend on technological systems that must operate flawlessly for generations. Unlike Earth societies where technology enhances human capabilities, lunar societies would be completely dependent on technology for basic survival. System failures that would be inconveniences on Earth could result in the extinction of entire human populations within hours. The economic sustainability of lunar colonies depends on developing local resource extraction and manufacturing capabilities that exceed anything achieved in terrestrial operations, while operating in conditions that destroy most industrial equipment rapidly. The economic models for lunar development assume technological capabilities and operational efficiencies that have never been demonstrated in any comparable environment. The financial risks of lunar development exceed those of any previous human undertaking, while offering uncertain returns over timelines that span generations. Environmental impact considerations take on new meaning when human activities could permanently alter environments that have remained unchanged for billions of years. Lunar industrial operations would create visible changes to the Moon's surface that could be seen from Earth, permanently altering humanity's relationship with its nearest celestial neighbor. The environmental consequences of lunar development are irreversible and could affect not just lunar environments, but Earth's relationship with space exploration and development. The strategic implications of lunar colonization could create geopolitical tensions that affect international cooperation and peace on Earth. Nations that develop successful lunar capabilities could gain advantages in space-based activities that affect terrestrial economic and military competition. The potential for conflicts over lunar resources and territory could extend Earth-based political tensions into space, while creating new sources of international conflict. Time pressure driven by geopolitical competition and resource concerns could drive rushed development timelines that increase risks for initial lunar populations while compromising long-term viability. International competition for lunar resources and strategic advantages creates incentives to proceed before adequate safety measures and research protections are in place. The pressure to achieve short-term political and economic objectives could override the scientific and ethical considerations that should govern such unprecedented experiments with human life and evolution. The irreversible nature of decisions about human evolution and development means that mistakes in lunar colonization efforts could have permanent consequences that affect humanity for generations. Unlike most human endeavors, where failures can be corrected through subsequent efforts, many aspects of lunar colonization involve irreversible changes to human biology, psychology, and culture. The consequences of failure could affect human evolution and civilization, in ways that could never be undone. Alternative approaches to space exploration and resource utilization might achieve similar scientific and economic objectives without exposing human populations to the unprecedented risks of permanent lunar colonization. Robotic exploration, temporary research facilities, and asteroid mining could provide many of the same benefits while avoiding the enormous costs and risks of creating permanent human settlements in such hostile environments. The fundamental question underlying all considerations of lunar colonization is whether the potential benefits justify conducting the most dangerous and uncertain experiment in human history. The moon represents not just a hostile environment that challenges human survival, but a testing ground where we would be exploring the absolute limits of human adaptability with consequences that could affect all future human evolution and civilization. Every aspect of this challenge, from the basic requirements of staying alive to the profound implications for human development, forces us to confront fundamental questions about human nature, our responsibilities to future generations, and our wisdom in undertaking experiments that could permanently alter the course of human evolution. The moon stands waiting, silent and deadly, ready to test whether humanity possesses not just the technological capability, but the wisdom and courage to expand beyond our home planet, while preserving what makes us essentially human. The choice we face isn't simply about whether we can establish permanent human presence on the moon, but whether we should. And that decision will define not just our future among the stars, but our understanding of what it means to be human in a universe that seems designed to challenge every assumption about our species' limitations and possibilities. The moon doesn't just threaten our bodies and our technology. It challenges our souls, our values, and our vision of humanity's destiny. And that might be the most impossible challenge of all. But perhaps the most chilling realization of all is that despite everything we've discussed, despite every impossible challenge and terrifying reality, humanity is still planning to do this. Not in some distant future when we've solved all these problems, but soon. NASA's Artemis program aims to establish a permanent lunar base within the next decade. Private companies are investing billions in lunar technologies. International space agencies are racing to claim lunar territory and resources. We're essentially watching our species prepare to conduct the most dangerous experiment in human history, and we're doing it with technologies that don't exist yet, safety protocols that haven't been tested, and medical knowledge that's completely inadequate for the challenges we'll face. It's like watching someone plan to climb Mount Everest using equipment made of cardboard and a map drawn in crayon. The disconnect between public perception and actual reality is staggering. Popular culture presents lunar colonization as an exciting adventure, a natural next step in human exploration. Movies show gleaming lunar cities with happy families, living comfortable lives just a short trip away from Earth. The reality we've explored tonight paints a picture that's so far removed from these fantasies that it borders on the absurd. Yet the momentum continues to build. Billions of dollars flow into lunar development programs. Engineers work around the clock designing systems that must operate flawlessly in conditions that destroy most technology. Astronauts train for missions that will test the absolute limits of human endurance and ingenuity. The machine of human ambition grinds forward, seemingly unstoppable despite the overwhelming evidence that what we're attempting may be impossible. The psychological phenomenon driving this contradiction is fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. Humans have an extraordinary ability to focus on potential benefits while minimizing or ignoring catastrophic risks. We see this pattern in everything from extreme sports to financial speculation, but never before have the stakes been so high or the consequences so permanent. The engineers and scientists working on lunar technologies understand many of these challenges better than anyone, yet they continue their work with remarkable dedication and optimism. They're not naive or uninformed. They're among the smartest, most capable people our species has ever produced. And they're betting their careers and sometimes their lives on the belief that human ingenuity can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. So here we are, staring at the ultimate paradox of human ambition. The moon represents everything our species has ever struggled against, distilled into one hostile, unforgiving world that seems designed to kill us in every conceivable way. Yet we're still going. Despite radiation that would cook us slowly, dust that would destroy our lungs, temperatures that would shatter our equipment, and isolation that would break our minds, we're still planning to call this nightmare home. Maybe that's exactly what makes us human.